I would like to invite all the speakers onto the stage, and I would also like to invite Australia's National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollands, who has kindly flown down from Sydney this morning. I didn't realise that. I assumed Anne lived in Canberra. So amazing effort, and I think Anne has, obviously a wealth of experience. She was the prior director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies and has over 23 years of experience in chief executive officer roles of government and non-government organisations. And I just feel really fortunate that we have a Children's Commissioner who's willing to be here today, and Anne does a lot across many things, and we're really grateful for her leadership. I might just kick off. I'll go to Slido in a second, but given we do have Anne here today, I thought we might just kick off with a question. So, Anne, could I just ask, from what you've heard today and the many things you do across the country, what would you say are the current barriers ensuring that children and young people are centre for policy and future generations too?
Thanks, Kate. And is this on? Thanks, Kate, and thank you very much for having me and giving me the chance to share a few reflections, and how inspiring after those presentations this morning. And it really shows how much fantastic work is happening, and the value of collaboration, and how far we've come, particularly in terms of the participation of children and young people. So there is a lot to celebrate. And everything that was just talked about, by the way, is consistent with a human rights-based approach, consistent with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and other international conventions that my role is meant to be monitoring in terms of implementation in Australia. But I wanted to just, I said to Kate, I just wanted to talk a little bit about barriers, because I think in many ways, I've been around the block a few times, and, we've got decades of evidence. We have the vision. That, doesn't mean we don't need more evidence. For any researcher in the room, I do support more research. But I think it has become more and more worrying to me, the lack of action on the evidence. And I'll just give you an example. We just launched a report a couple of weeks ago on 12 years worth of royal commissions and inquiries, where we found over 3,000 recommendations that were constantly repeated. And as you know, periodically, every time there's some tragedy in the media, someone will call for another royal commission. So it just spoke to me of the fact that there's a lack of accountability, and I actually think a lack of accountability mechanisms within government. So it's great to hear that work being done within government, but my experience, I have to say, is that even the MPs who I would call are champions for child wellbeing, they are frustrated because of the lack of mechanisms in government. I think that goes to the way government itself works. So I'll just mention, I'm going to be very brief, I'm just going to mention really just one of the barriers, which is the mechanisms of government. It has a few different parts. So first of all, and by the way, this is the low-hanging fruit, in my view, National Cabinet. So we know that National Cabinet has as a key priority women and women's safety. We know that there's a ministerial council. We know that they're monitoring gender-based violence. This is fantastic. We know that there's a Minister for Women. We've had one, I think, since the Whitlam years. We know we have a women's budget statement that provides transparency and accountability on spending on women's issues. All of that is in place, but we have none of that for children, none of it. And to me, this is the low-hanging fruit. It could be done now with a stroke of a pen today. They could decide to make child wellbeing a national priority for National Cabinet, which means it's across the Federation, because if I had more time, I'd talk about the Federation failing our most vulnerable children, but I won't go there today. But the National Cabinet is the governance mechanism. And so we need National Cabinet to make child wellbeing a key priority in the way it's done with women's safety. That is the low-hanging fruit. We need a Minister for Children in Cabinet. We need budget statements on spending on child wellbeing, using all of the work that's being done by these guys and others around Australia. I mean, there is so much that could be used that's not being used for accountability purposes, right? So we need to do that. I think we need some legislation. So we've heard a lot lately, if you've been following, about a Human Rights Act for Australia. That's important. But a lot of countries, as well as a Human Rights Act, they have something like a National Act for Children that incorporates the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that provides accountability mechanisms for the things that are in ARACY's nest, for example. You know, and these are cross-portfolio, of course, and cross-jurisdictional. And we need a ministerial, in my view, we need a ministerial council for child wellbeing. We don't have that either. So, you know, these are things that are absolutely missing, that are core to the way government does its work, core to how the Federation is governed. And it's, by the way, it's all about the Federation. If we're not talking about the Federation, we're not serious, because that's how these issues are dealt with in this country. And we need to work together as a Federation. That's the opportunity. And then finally, I think we probably need forums like this that focus just on the barriers and barrier busting, because no amount of new evidence will cut through, despite the goodwill of those MPs that really want to see change, unless we tackle the very problems within government itself. These are the elephants in the room, and I often find they're not talked about enough. So I wanted to make sure I put them out there today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anne. We do have 40 minutes, so if anyone has a question from the room before we go to Slido, is there anyone who's got a burning response or question for Anne on that? Yep.
Hi, me again, Chelsea, Planetary Health Equity Hothouse. I was wondering, Anne, if you could just expand on that and talk about why you think some of those things, it's so easy, stroke of the pen and things, and I totally agree, but what is the barrier to actually getting that moving? What are we facing? What do we need to do to get over that hump?
I'll try and be brief. That's a whole workshop's worth of discussion too. A cultural problem. Children are invisible largely when it comes to policy. Policy leans towards the concerns of adults, and there is a huge presumption that if you do things for adults, then someone called it trickle-down child wellbeing to me. That's what we think. It's a legacy of the children will be seen and not heard thing. And it's this sort of default that as adults, we default to our own perspective. We don't bother to ask kids, but except when we do, we're all totally surprised at what they tell us often, because they do have very unique needs and perspectives, right? And the more that we can hear from those, the better. So that's one short answer. I guess another thing I'd say is that for both sides of politics, the major parties, there is a legacy of not wanting to interfere in the privacy of family life. And so for different reasons, so I see them going, oh no, we can't, you know, step over what parents are doing. And then finally, I'll say, you know, if you watch Question Time, which as a nerd I often do, you'll hear workers' rights, women's rights, consumer rights talked about. So it's not that we don't like rights. You never hear children's rights. I have never once heard a politician get up and talk about children's rights, and I've never heard a newsreader talk about children's rights. And I personally have decided I don't actually use that term now. It doesn't roll off the tongue easily. We feel awkward and uncomfortable as a country culturally with that. Now I will talk about the human rights of children, because that's what that means, the human rights of children. And what I've noticed is people go, oh, a little bit more, just a tad. But look, this is a mountain we're climbing.
Thanks very much, Anne. And certainly, you know, 15 to 24-year-olds in the Mission Australia report, the number one concern was climate worry and climate change. So if we were listening to young people, we'd be seeing very different policy. I'm going to turn to Slido now. So the first question I have, and I might just throw this one to Ros to start with. There is a difference between investing in the wellbeing of children, that is helping them as children now and setting them up for better outcomes later, and of future generations, recognising their needs may be compromised by current policy. Are governments effectively considering this difference at the moment?
No. And I think the longer answer is, and Taylor and I have discussed this as well, it links to that very question. As a society, we have said children are within the realm of the family, and we will talk about family policies and hope for the best in terms of how children turn out. And like, we're all in this room, we were children once, we're okay, right? Like that is what is actually driving children's policy. Yeah, it was okay for me, so it's going to be okay for everybody else, right? Like that is not how good policy decisions are made, but that is one of the kind of deep-rooted beliefs that drives the work that we do around children's policy. Is really that individual belief that I turned out okay. And so then we see children in the realm of the family, and we don't want to get involved in families because families are private and they're doing okay, right, generally, right? Until we start talking about women's safety. And that's kind of actually opening the door on the broader understanding of what it means to be family and how we actually do have a policy imperative for good outcomes for our community to be working in and with families. There's also, so that was kind of more your question than this distinction between children and futures. But the point I'm trying to make is it's so hard to think about children right now that it's extremely hard to think about futures, because that's tomorrow's problem. And again, this kind of short-termism and it'll be okay because it's always been okay drives so much of what we see in our policies, and we tinker at the edges. And I loved hearing Anne. She's actually calling for radical reform of our democracy. She said very nice words about it, but when you like dig in, she's like, would you like get rid of the federation, start again, radical change to how our democracy operates, and it's actually what's needed. It's actually what we need to be able to progress these conversations and to progress real policy outcome for children and for futures. Because at the moment, our deep-rooted beliefs as humans, coupled with the way that our policies and our structures reinforce them, make it very hard to break through for real change in these spaces. I know Taylor has a view as well.
I second the no. And I'd also just say, and I think this is the art of this space, is like, yes, there's nuance and significant difference in the areas of work, but like the developmental implications on a child today is what will shape the leader 50 years from now who's making the decisions in our policies. So it is absolutely, like, the Venn diagram's nearly a circle, I would say, on what this work means. And it's why I think we need to be collaborating so that we're not huddling off in a corner saying we're going to have a futures commission or institute, and it's not considering what other entities do we already have in place, what have we tried previously that didn't work, how can we service these other agendas that have been working tirelessly for an incredibly long time to get headway in this space. So I think it's just a test to the need for collaboration, I think. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Anne, did you want to have a comment? No. Okay, great. So thanks very much. The next question we have is probably for Carolyn, maybe me, but the Future Healthy Countdown 2030 has a fantastic vision, but I struggle to see how another dashboard can affect change when the data is already well reported. Would our resources be better spent elsewhere?
That is a question we have definitely asked ourselves and pondered, and I'm glad whoever put that to us. The point of difference is that, and again, we've really highlighted through this discussion a lot of knowledge but not action. So what is another step, another measure, another tool that can be used that can actually broaden an audience? So that's why we deliberately focused on a timeline. So that it's got that 2030 deadline to create some of that urgency. That's why we deliberately included went for the policy focus, and then especially with the overarching policy focus of the Future Generations Commission, which really gives that focus and that imperative for thinking about now and into the future. So that's, I guess, for me, the point of difference and the point of value that I think the countdown can offer. But also, I think for those of us who've been around a short or a long time, these things aren't closed shops. And I used to despair and think, oh, everything should be harmonised and matching. Things can't and won't. The top order thing we're striving for, we, as in the good guys, will not change. But it's there at times different mechanisms bring other coalitions together, and going through the MJA actually brings a different audience. It brings a different another voice. You think about, if you get the MJA, then you can fire up the AMA and some of those other medical institutions that do have a lot of clout. So we're bringing that in. We're also bringing in that coalition and that experience of children and young people, which again, obviously the nest is very much founded on, but it's again another addition and amplification of what's already in place. But for me, the policy focus and the timeline and that overarching ask is what really pushes it that next step. Okay.
Thanks. I might just add to that. You know, I think choosing indicators and outcome measures is a real challenge. When you have adolescent health people and child health people in the room, and someone was saying it's the first 1,000 days, and then the other group is saying it's 10,000 days, these are really problematic. And, you know, I criticised measuring what matters this morning with the 50 indicators, but I do appreciate how hard it is. I do think we can do better than, I think it's actually like 1 or 2 really that are good. And I looked at it this morning, and for AEDC, one of the best measures we have of whether children are developmentally on track at school, it says it's improved at the overall level. Now, that's actually not the case when you look at the children who are going up, are high SES children in the highest areas, and we've got disadvantaged children from disadvantaged backgrounds going down. So it just shows you the complexities when we do have these type of dashboards and how they work. And I think focusing on the policy actions for Future Healthy Countdown is a really good way to go, because, you know, if Sandra or Sharon or people who are meeting with policymakers, I'm not there yet, have, you know, these simple policy actions that are doable now, that have support from a lot of people, I think that can help us. It's not going to change the world, but if we talk about in Future Healthy Countdown, if we could get 1 or 2 of these up by 2030, that would be a great thing.
I'll just add to that, you know, that they're doable now. I mean, I think this is the stories. So I get to brief a lot of ministers, but also ministerial advisors. And I remember just recently standing out to me that the ministerial advisor saying, we don't disagree with anything you're saying, Commissioner. They don't disagree. Everyone agrees. But tell us, what we can tell our minister is the mechanism they can use to enact the change. So I think as well as like giving the data, if we can then point to, well, here are the doable steps that can be taken now. Some of them will be short-term, some of them will be long-term. They need our help. That's what I'm being told.
Thanks, Anne. Carolyn, did you have anything to add? No. Okay, great. I'll go to the next question. So children need time to play, learn, thrive, rest, be creative, but their overworked parents can't give it to them. Is there any discussion among advocates of child and youth wellbeing to move towards a 4-day school week and a standard 4-day working week? I might throw that to, does anyone want to take that?
I had a conversation at morning tea yesterday with somebody. I'm just seeing if they're in the room. Yeah, there you go. So yes, we talked about this yesterday. And I think the conversation we ended up having is about what we value. And I think that was the really interesting reflection also from Ken Henry's presentation. What do we value? We have this growth economy mindset that we need to do more to make more. But to what end? Where does that stop? Where do we actually go, okay, we're comfortable, we're satisfied now. We don't need to keep growing the economy. We don't need the GDP as our cornerstone measure. We can look at wellbeing. We can look at some other aspects and have them as our cornerstone measure. So the thing that drives a lot of the work that we do is the realisation that children, we have all these 6 domains and other ways of thinking about wellbeing. Whether they're in an ECEC setting, a home, a school, a playground, if those 6 things are being met, they will thrive. They will learn in different places. They will be healthy in different ways. We don't need to kind of put these formal boxes around everything because children don't exist in formal boxes. They exist in a variety of different spaces. We need to also recognise that with humans, actually how we contribute, what we contribute, and how is that valued. We saw this during COVID when we actually valued care work and we actually valued health workers. And then COVID went away and we went back to valuing economists and accountants and I love some of them and I don't mean to disparage them, but is that as a society what we put at the pinnacle of what it is that we need to thrive? Like, we actually need to really have this conversation about what does it mean to be well. And so I really applaud the conversations that are happening in this space. We just need to keep pushing and taking them more broadly, because otherwise we will reach a point where there is no futures, because we've just exploded everything. And also I'm reading dystopian science fiction at bed at night, and that's coming through my thinking, and I need to find a different book.
I don't read that stuff. But what we know from decades of evidence and from children themselves, including children in prisons who I've been talking to in the last year for our Youth Justice Reform report that will be tabled in Parliament in about a month, is what matters most to children is their relationships. It's all about relationships. That's where all of their development, their learning, their well-being comes from. And if we need to restructure how we run our societies and make it 4-day weeks or whatever to support those very, very important relationships, that would be a response to listening to what kids say they need.
Number one, I would love a 4-day week. I think I'm doing a 7-day week at the moment. And no, the reason I keep declining is I am a firm believer in speak with confidence when you have something additional to add, but you're covering these questions so fantastically that I'll happily sit here. I'm good.
Thanks very much. Okay, so the next question I wanted to throw to Taylor is actually for you. So there is a lot of apathy for young people in the democratic process. What are your suggestions to get more youth participation to represent themselves?
Easy question. Great. I think there's a few different factors, and actually one with a bunch of economists last night at the CEDA dinner, we were talking about how the cost of living crisis will result in decreased volunteer hours of young people, which will then result in decreased political participation. Because if you look at those young people who are most politically engaged, and I'm a great case study, I've been volunteering since I was 14 because I've had the privilege to do so, because I have not only had access to the information of how that was possible, the relationships to enable me to get into those opportunities, but then the time and the luxury of that to continue doing that into my 20s. As we see economic landscapes become even more challenging, that will reduce. And so I think finding ways that we can make those opportunities available to young people, because if you look at the stats, young people aren't engaging less in community activities, they're engaging less by some measures in democracy. So sad, I know. And so the appetite is not gone. If anything, I'm seeing an increase. And when you give young people, like our team is a great example, we have young people who work full days at their very demanding jobs, many of whom work on the Hill, who then want to show up and do 5 hours of volunteering by themselves in their room on their laptop to do research onto how to make the future look better. And so I would say the energy is there. It's just a matter of giving them spaces that feel safe, that feel like they will genuinely be listened to, that feel that there's actual creativity and appetite for things to be different. I think the desire to participate in iterative change, that is low, but the willingness to give everything to the opportunity for some of the more substantive changes that I think we've already heard about today is huge. And so it's not an easy answer, and I'm happy to speak for many hours to anyone who wants to go through the many different options. But if I was to rattle off a few, investing in getting more, I think you globally have 2.4% of people under the age of 30 are parliamentarians, or sorry, put that sentence the other way around, when 52% of the global population is under 30. So number one, let's get more people in Parliament. There's some great programs already doing that, but I would say, even if it's in your conversations, like whenever I run a youth event, it is a goal that I have, speak to a young person and explain to them how they could get into politics. Roslyn is a great example of this as well. I'm sure you do the same. And show them that it's possible, and obviously find the people who maybe have the fortitude to do it, because it's not an easy path. But also just better education, and that is in the formal sense, but also in the social sense. Like, how can we make conversations about politics more common? Like, I am not proud of this. I couldn't have told you the difference between an MP and a minister when I was 20. Frightening, I know. And so it's been a steep learning curve, but if we can make it more socially normal that we talk about the mechanics of politics in just community conversation, I think that will help. Sorry, long answer.
Thanks, Taylor. Does anyone else have a comment?
Kids today. Everybody has said it, every generation since we began coming out of wherever, kids today. And there's these great articles you can find from 1910 lamenting the state of childhood. And then from the 1960s, kids today, what are they getting into? Like, is it a rite of passage that we know that we're old when we're talking about kids today? I think we, again, talking about, like, I went home last night and I was angry at Ken Henry for saying, why aren't children marching in the streets? It's like, why are you not paying attention when they do? And they always have been, right? Like, it's actually, there is actually a lot going on. And just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening and it's not valuable. And it is about, again, what we value, how we see it, and the ongoing narrative that has stretched with us for decades and centuries about kids today. Yeah, kids today.
Thanks, Ros. Okay, I think the next question is fits with this. We have, I think we're going to 12:45. Is that right, Jackie? Let me know if it's not. Great. So I want to go to one more question from Slido. These are the questions that had the most votes, and then we might just go to everyone in the room, because I think that would help with kind of more interactive discussion. So this next question, though, is something we grappled a lot with for the Future Healthy Countdown, and I think a lot of people have an opinion about it. So can the panel discuss what they think is the likelihood of a Future Generations Commissioner being instated versus a Children's Minister being instated? A future generations agenda may benefit from a greater policy focus on children today. I might throw that to Anne first.
The question is, what's the likelihood? I would just say we need both. We need to take children seriously, but we also need to take the future and generations' future seriously. So there's not one or the other. But the problem is, can I just, sorry. The problem is, as a commissioner in a commission, yeah, that doesn't necessarily, I mean, there's no power. People think you have some kind of power. There is no power. There's often very little money to do the job. That's why a minister and a national cabinet key priority, I think you have to have that as well. So commissions sound good, but without that government mechanism, it can just be sidelined easily, just as the Australian Human Rights Commission has been sidelined from my experience.
Yeah, say that out loud.
Just in violent agreement. Yep.
Thanks. From the room.
Just get following on your point. So people like. Oh yeah, sure. Just a reminder, we do have a large number of people online. We haven't. Helps if it's turned on. I think your point there was really important, Anne. Could you maybe expand on that? Because the thing I think that's had the real impact in Wales is not so much the commissioner, it's the powers and the obligations that put into the Act about the accountability of the mechanisms of government and how any policy or budget process has to be assessed against its impact.
I just agree. Yes. Wales and other countries, even in the UK, who we think of kind of our family, have got legislative foundations for the rights of children, for example, that we do not have. So they have both. And I have just experienced the sidelining. I mean, Australia has children's commissioners in every state and territory. I think in total, if you include New Zealand, there's about 14. It's not a small number, but it doesn't fix the problem, right? We try to shout as loud as we can together. It doesn't work. So commissions are not the answer without legislation. That is my view.
The other few things that I'll just jump in with is, number one, when we started Foundations for Tomorrow, I don't know if anyone knows the organisation Think Forward, but they focus on like present day tax and transfer inequities. And when we started, the founder of Think Forward, I got confused with her so many times. The amount of times I got called Sonia, too many that I can count. And I think there's this urge that when there's other people working in the space asking for something that's like maybe values aligned but different, we go to say, no, it should be this way. No, it should be this proposal. And I think it's one of the biggest pitfalls that we have for like progressive equity driven agendas is that we pick our patch and we say it is this way or the highway and we have the answer. And it's a huge mistake we're making. I think the more that we can bring this unified front, it closes some of the doors to avoid the overall agenda that I know we're all united in. So the more that we can all resist the urge to say, but this is better because, and instead say, and that is why you have no choice but to do one of these, and then we can work together behind closed doors on how can we continue to compile our insights. I think that's number one. To the Welsh point, I think it's also the incredible in-depth work they've done in the ways of working, the cultural pieces, the even understanding that Sophie Howe took of her role as a coach and as a confidant for the people working within government, and that empathy-driven approach that I really think was at the heart of how she took that role on. It is, if we ever had one, I think a key function, which is helping that collaboration, introducing people across departments in the soft power. I also would love to see some teeth on it, but the soft power element, and the fact that it was built on a national conversation and a way of creating that unified vision that could then be held, like have that accountability piece to it.
Thanks, Taylor. I just add to that in the research world with the Future Healthy Countdown, that idea that, you know, we all have to come together and amplify each other's work, not that one piece is better than anyone else's. And that was a real challenge for us because there is so much happening in the children and young people's space, and we wanted to add and complement it. So trying to not be competitive, which is hard in an academic environment, but we need to do it. Did anyone else have any other questions from the room? Yep, I can see Adam over the back.
Just got a bit of a, maybe a bit of a left sort of out of the box question. From in Europe, we're starting to see young men really become very active in the political discourse. They are probably being described as hard right and the like. I'd be really keen for any insights, and hopefully in a constructive way, of what are they saying and what do we think of that and what can we be doing to encourage that, and, you know, listen, what, you know, actually be seen to be listening to what is their well-being, opportunities or issues that they're actually crying out for. I just think we're starting to see some interesting emerging trends, particularly amongst young men, and will we see more of it?
Thanks, Adam. Does anyone have a...
I think an important element is to acknowledge it, not marginalise it. And I think that's how these things do gain so much action and oxygen, because that creates that, well, no one's listening and I have to push harder. So there's definitely an approach there. And that's why I think having different hooks, mechanisms, angles, wide approaches, you talked about inclusivity, so that conversations aren't, and I immediately, I made that offhand remark before about the good guys. That's actually not a helpful remark. I should call myself out on that, because you're already defining, that's setting a boundary of who's in and who's out and making some assumptions. And I think we should keep conversations open to say, look, let's look beyond at what we want. And then that opens up people to share their experiences, their feelings of loss, their feelings of not being heard, of being marginalised. So I think it's up to us to be more open. And I'm going to call myself out. That was not a good call, because you don't really know who. Good guys and bad guys is a really unhelpful way of framing things. Left and right even can be an interesting one. There's sometimes some strange connections we can find if we push through a little bit more.
It's a strange example that I like to give. I used to be a surf lifesaver, and they teach you that when you're approaching someone who's drowning, to approach with your foot ready to kick them if they try and climb on top of you and drown you. And I keep that in mind because, sorry, it's relevant, I promise. Promise, and it's based in kindness. The thing that I keep with that is, with this many things shifting in society, there are people who feel that they are drowning. There are people who feel they're not being heard. As to the varying levels of validity of that, that's a whole other conversation, and happy to have a feminist debate on any of these parts. But I think the piece is we need to work on helping the people who feel that they are drowning, helping them have in-person community spaces, I do think, because we're facing a lot of polarization issues on social media, and help them, once again, as I mentioned before, safe spaces to air their grievances in a constructive way and to be heard, and then to feed into the system. Because if you close the door of the system to people, they feel that there's no other choice than to jump on the person who's trying to save them and push them under. So I think creating that sense of safety for everyone.
Yeah, I completely agree, Taylor. And I think this all comes, back to this, the constant theme I'm hearing through this conference is this idea of a national conversation and people having a voice and being heard, and trust in democracy. And I so often hear people say, I don't really care I wish I didn't have to vote. I think, oh goodness, like, so how do we, I think it all comes back to making people feel valued in the society too. I think we have a lot of work to do in that space.
I was just going to add to that comment you just made, Taylor, about safe spaces. We're doing some research looking at what young people have told us over the last 5 years through every mechanism that we've given them over the last 5 years. Not from ARACY, but from many different organisations, the mission survey, the work the commissioners are doing. We talk to children and young people actually quite a lot, and then we put it on a shelf. So we're trying to do that research to bring it to the fore. And one of the things that came through quite strongly was the need for what we're terming third space. So we've got home, we've got school, but where is it that young people can be and children can be that is not within those defined boundaries? And it's kind of surprising. Like of all the questions we asked, we didn't ask that question, but it's come through very strongly in the responses that there is a need for safe third spaces so children can be and explore, and that's a space to explore these kind of thoughts, to explore these kind of issues, to access knowledge in different ways and to help shape children and young people to be participants in our society. And they're looking for it, they want it. And we continually shut it down. We talk about gangs, we talk about feeling unsafe in our streets. Really, it is children and young people looking for spaces to be.
I'm going to hand to Taylor. I think she's got it.
Sorry, just a quick addition, which is, and I know this feels ironic being the young person saying this, I think it's yes, safe spaces for young people and for leaders who just don't quite get it. Because I would say if you asked me, if I had to narrow it down to what are the 10 most impactful hours that I have spent over the last 3 years doing this work, it has been the times where maybe emotionally I was screaming a little bit on the inside, but I held my cool and held a safe space for a leader who just had no comprehension for why I thought this was a reasonable idea, and enabled them to walk through the logic path that they were currently on and us to see, okay, we actually don't disagree on these first 7 steps you're taking logically. We just deviate here, and creating that common ground. So I think, yes, safe space for young people and safe space for established leaders who maybe are not currently on side with this agenda, but that we can create the environment to unpack the logic chain with them so they feel welcomed into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. And I want to give a plug for the Future Healthy Countdown 2030 supplement that's coming out in November, because the whole edition, apart from the countdown paper, is on participating. And Sharon Bessel, I'm not sure if she's here today, Professor Sharon Bessel has done an amazing paper on just this, on the spaces outside the home and schools in the middle years, and how we need to have a society that actively supports children and offers opportunities to them, and to go to that heart of kind of engaging in the civic society elements and the benefits that can bring for their health and well-being and for everyone as a society. We are almost at the end. I guess I just want to kind of reflect on what an amazing session this means, but I would like to put a question to each of the speakers at the end, which is, if the people in the room, if you could give them one thing that we can all go away today and think, what can we do to help this conversation? It's an uphill battle at the moment. I'm working on Future Healthy Countdown. I've been absolutely shocked at some of the statistics. I keep going on about it, but 1.3% of schools receive the bare basic public funding that they need. And last year we gave $14.5 billion to subsidise fossil fuel industry. This is from the Australian Institute, that data. Pasi Salzberg calculated recently what it would take to properly fund public schools next year, $6.8 billion. And we can't do that as a society. It's just gobsmacking. So it's an absolute bare minimum that we can't even provide for our children. So these challenges are huge. So I guess, sorry, I don't want to finish on a pessimistic note, but as an optimistic note, and I think finishing on Future Gen is going to give us that optimism, what can we do, and what can people in this room do to try and make sure children and young people and future generations are a priority?
Well, I think the most simple thing is to not accept the status quo and to ask why. You know, there's a lot of questions we need to ask decision makers, and some of them are like your local members of parliament. Some of them are the aspiring members of parliament. We do have a federal election coming up, so it's a great opportunity. They will want to talk to you. So we should ask why do we tolerate this? Why do we tolerate the local public school having, substandard toilets, which is what I see, with my own grandchildren? Why do we, why don't we rise up in the streets and say this is not okay? But also, why is it that when National Cabinet is set up to deal with key priority matters and crises like women's safety, why is it not dealing with the failures of our systems to properly support the well-being of children and young people? We have to ask why, and we need to hold them accountable.
Yes. Everything that Anne said. But on a personal level, every single one of us knows a child. We might not have one that we own. God, I hate that term. But we all know children. Yeah, right? Like, God, even the language in, like, yes, needs to change the status quo. But children, young people exist in our community, in our society. Listen to them. Find some time in your own day to, in a non-creepy way, listen. Engage in a conversation with it. What do they enjoy doing on a Saturday afternoon? What's their favourite story? What are they looking forward to having for dinner tomorrow? Actually hear what children, that's a children conversation, young people might be a slightly different conversation, but what children and young people are actually thinking about. What are they enjoying? What are they doing? Find the time in our own busy days in our lives to centre children in our thinking. And if we can't do it, how can we expect our decision makers and our policy leaders to do it? We just have to build in time, and it sounds really simple, but it is a way of valuing their thoughts, of valuing their feelings and hearing what's going on for them right now. So it's taking that time to listen to what children and young people are saying, because they're trying to tell us a lot of stuff and we don't always hear it.
That's the thing down the line. So I was going to say listen, but I'm going to reframe it and say my challenges are to commit, to think about targets or quotas or KPIs if you're into those kinds of things. I set KPIs for my kids once and did not go well. They looked at me like, Mum, you are not at work. However, I reckon subliminally it did work. But we're here because we're mostly here on paid time, right? So we have day jobs. How often have we said, and I've said it today, up at the podium, we're involving more children and young people. So my challenge is in the next piece of work you do, the next program you scope, the next thing you run, the next whatever it is, think of a thing and make sure that you include somebody who is under the age, and I'm going to say of 25 people. Yeah, because being the lone, I'm the youngest person. That's okay. She's just rewriting my KPIs. This is fine. So at least 2 people, set your own targets, but under the age of 25 at least. So start with that. Just say, right, the next thing we do is going to involve in a meaningful way for some of the design or delivery, these younger people. And that starts to change things. I think that's that incremental change really sets the person not there now, but it's a culture mindset piece. All system change comes from mindsets. So we need to really open our minds.
I think you just demonstrated in action the point that I would want to make, which is this idea of collaboration. Like the success that Foundations for, exactly, well done. It was a great example. The success that we've had over the last few years is entirely based on the partnerships and collaborations we've been able to foster. Like give the CPD team a big shout out right now. It's only because they started coming to our parliamentary group meetings and they gave me a very valuable nudge on mistakes that I was about to make that I managed to avoid, that we have then had more success than we ever would have had without that. And that was because it was a mutually sort of like respectful, genuine collaboration that is now like one of our most valued partnerships that we have. And so I would encourage everyone in this room, like if you're not already meaningfully working with a youth-driven organization, I promise you they would love to. And it will be a huge help. As I said, youthful tenacity, pair it with years around the block, and it's a game changer. So I think don't be afraid of that intergenerational collaboration.